fateful evening, Madame Bimbo's neighbor, Ngozi, knocked on her door to borrow some salt. Hearing no answer but finding the door unlocked, she pushed it open and stepped inside. Her heart froze at the sight before her. In the dimly lit room, 9 men, including Madame Bimbo's husband, stood naked, surrounding little Ada, who sat on the floor, her face streaked with tears. Ngozi gasped in horror as she realized what was happening. The men were taking turns violating the helpless child. The village buzzed with tales of Madame Bimbo, a woman whose wealth and influence had grown over the years. She was one of the richest women around, known for her classic bar, which was always filled with the sound of laughter and the clinking of glasses. Her establishment was a hub for the wealthy men of the area, who came in sleek cars and parked by her store, eagerly making their way inside. For these men, Madame Bimbo was more than just a businesswoman. She was an enigma who knew how to keep them entertained, and they rewarded her with heavy tips and gifts. But no one truly understood what went on behind the doors of Madame Bimbo's bar. The laughter, the money, and the smiles were only the surface of a well-kept secret. She had a special arrangement with her loyal customers, men who were willing to pay handsomely for more than just drinks. These were wealthy patrons, some married, others single, but all bound by discretion. Madame Bimbo offered them something unique in her inner chamber, the companionship of young, beautiful women who worked at her bar. These women, her special staff, were a part of her secret business, carefully chosen and trained not only to serve but to entertain her clients in ways they didn't discuss openly. To keep her secret safe, Madame Bimbo was meticulous about her hiring process. Any young woman interested in working at her bar had to take an oath of silence, swearing never to reveal the true nature of their work. The vow was not just a formality, it was a binding promise, a contract that secured Madame Bimbo's reputation and her livelihood. As long as the secret stayed hidden, her business would continue to thrive, and her riches would continue to grow. And so, however, as time went on, something unexpected began to happen. Fewer customers started coming through her doors. At first, Madame Bimbo thought little of it. Perhaps it was just a temporary lull, she mused, as she counted the evening's earnings one quiet night. But the drop in business persisted, and soon, she could no longer ignore the empty tables and quiet rooms. Disturbed, Madame Bimbo decided to take matters into her own hands. She began reaching out to her regular clients, calling them one by one, hoping to discover the reason behind their sudden absence. After a series of polite but evasive responses, one of her oldest clients, Chief Okoro, finally revealed the truth. "Madame Bimbo," he said, with a sigh, "we need something new. Your girls, they are lovely, but they are not as fresh as they once were. We need younger faces, newer faces." The words struck Madame Bimbo like a bolt of lightning. She realized that her girls, who had been with her for years, were indeed showing the effects of their long hours and strenuous work. Many of them were beginning to look tired, drained from years of serving Madame Bimbo's demanding clientele. They had given their youth and energy to her business, and in doing so, had lost some of the very appeal that drew men to her bar in the first place. Now, Madame Bimbo understood what needed to be done. She had to bring in fresh faces, young women who would revitalize her bar and restore the allure that once kept her customers coming back. Determined to revamp her business, Madame Bimbo began her search for new staff with a vigor that matched her ambition. She placed calls to her contacts, spread the word through town criers, and even posted flyers across the village. "Madame Bimbo is hiring," the flyers read, promising generous wages and enticing benefits for any young women willing to work at her bar. But the job opening, despite its attractive pay, wasn't as appealing as she'd hoped. Many of the village girls had heard whispers about Madame Bimbo's establishment, and the exhausted faces of her current employees only fueled their hesitation. Days turned into weeks, and only a handful of young women dared to apply. But none of them met Madame Bimbo's exacting standards. They were either too cautious or too burdened by responsibilities that might compromise their loyalty. What she needed was someone fresh, free of ties, and in need of the type of money only she could offer. Just as Madame Bimbo was beginning to lose hope, a young orphan named Amoka stepped forward. Amoka was a quiet girl, barely out of her teens, who lived with her elderly grandmother. Life had been hard on her, and with no family to support her, she struggled to make ends meet. When she heard of Madame Bimbo's job offer, she hesitated, having heard some unsettling rumors. But the promise of a steady income was too tempting to ignore, especially since it meant she could finally provide a comfortable life for her ailing grandmother. On the day she arrived at the bar for an interview, Amoka was struck by the weary expressions of the other staff. Their eyes were tired, their smiles forced, and something about them seemed heavy, as though they carried a weight invisible to everyone else. Curious, she approached one of the girls and quietly asked, "Why does everyone look so sad here?" The girl, glancing over her shoulder nervously, replied in a low voice, "It's just the work. It takes a toll." Before Amoka could ask more, Madame Bimbo appeared, her gaze sharp as she welcomed Amoka with open arms. After a brief conversation, she presented Amoka with the oath of silence and a contract. Desperate for money, Amoka signed the document without hesitation, sealing her fate as Madame Bimbo's newest recruit. Amoka's first week at Madame Bimbo's bar was a whirlwind of introductions and learning the ropes. Madame Bimbo was surprisingly kind, offering her tips and small bonuses to make her feel comfortable in her new environment. The kindness put Amoka at ease, and she grew hopeful that this job might be her chance at a stable income. On her way home each night, she bought little treats for her grandmother, a few beans, some raw pap, grateful that she could finally afford to bring something home. But as the days passed, Madame Bimbo's true intentions began to reveal themselves. Near the end of Amoka's first week, Madame Bimbo informed her that she would be required to work overnight shifts, a task she hadn't anticipated. "But Ma, I didn't tell my grandmother," Amoka protested, worry flashing in her eyes. Her grandmother, who already worried every time Amoka was late, would be concerned if she didn't come home at all. Madame Bimbo dismissed her concerns with a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Amoka. I'll send a message to your grandmother, letting her know that you're safe and that you'll be here working hard. She'll understand." Relieved, Amoka accepted Madame Bimbo's promise, believing that her grandmother would receive the message. With her worries eased, she steeled herself for her first overnight shift, unaware that this was just the beginning of the demands Madame Bimbo would place upon her. That night, the bar was alive with the usual chatter and music, the DJ playing old tunes that filled the air with a nostalgic vibe. Amoka, still new to the job, felt a small thrill of excitement as she thought about her first week's pay and what it would mean for her and her grandmother. She served the young man a steaming bowl of pepper soup and a bottle of beer, noticing his sharp gaze lingering on her as she moved around the room. Trying to ignore the look, she returned to her seat, letting the music wash over her as she planned the small comforts she would soon bring home. But her thoughts were abruptly interrupted when Madame Bimbo approached, her face void of expression. She tapped Amoka lightly on the shoulder and said in a low voice, "Go attend to the young man in the inner chamber. He's waiting for you." Amoka hesitated, sensing an unfamiliar edge to Madame Bimbo's tone. She nodded, forcing herself to act confidently as she headed towards the inner room. When she stepped inside, her confidence dissolved in an instant. The young man lay completely naked on the bed, a disturbing smile on his face. Her heart pounded as she tried to understand what was happening. "Sir, what do you want?" she stammered, her voice shaky. He leaned back, his eyes dark and unyielding. "I want to eat you," he sneered, his voice thick with desire. "Come to Daddy." Realizing his intentions, Amoka began to edge back, hoping to find an escape. Her mind raced with possible ways to get out, but before she could move, the man sprang forward, grabbing her with brutal force. Amoka struggled, but he overpowered her, forcing himself on her again and again. The pain was unbearable, and her cries were muffled as he took what he wanted without remorse. She felt herself slipping away, her mind numbing under the trauma until she finally went breathless, slipping into unconsciousness. When the man realized what he had done, he hastily grabbed his clothes, sneaking out of the room through the window, leaving Amoka's lifeless body behind. The next morning, as the sun rose and the bar's usual routine began, a cleaner entered the inner chamber to tidy up. She froze at the sight before her. Amoka's body lay sprawled on the bed, blood pooled beneath her. Her heart raced with terror, and she immediately ran to find Madame Bimbo. Madame Bimbo entered the room, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. But instead of horror or remorse, she merely sighed, her face impassive. "This girl has a bad spirit," she muttered. "Only 1 week of working here, and she's brought this upon herself." She turned to the other staff, her expression sharp and unforgiving. "Listen to me carefully," she commanded, her voice cold. "This stays within us. If anyone asks about her, you say you don't know her. She never worked here, understand?" The girls nodded, though fear and disgust flickered in their eyes. Madame Bimbo wasted no time. She quickly organized a quiet burial, and before the morning was over, Amoka's body lay in an unmarked grave behind the bar. Days passed, and Amoka's grandmother grew increasingly anxious. She had not seen her granddaughter since she left for work, and worry gnawed at her heart. She spoke to a few neighbors, describing her concerns, her voice fraught with worry. "Please," she begged, "if anyone is passing by Madame Bimbo's bar, can you stop in and check on my Amoka? I'm too old to make the trip myself." Moved by her distress, a few men agreed to go to the bar and inquire. They arrived at Madame Bimbo's establishment and asked if they could speak to Amoka. The staff, however, repeated Madame Bimbo's instructions. "We don't know anyone by that name," they lied, their voices flat and cold. "No one like that works here." The men left, their minds uneasy, but they had no reason to suspect otherwise. They returned to Amoka's grandmother with heavy hearts, telling her they had found no sign of her granddaughter. The old woman's worry turned to dread, and she began to wonder if something terrible had happened. As the days passed, a sense of dread settled over Madame Bimbo's bar. Word of Amoka's disappearance had spread quietly through the village, and whispers of missing girls began to surface. Meanwhile, the other young women working for Madame Bimbo lived in constant fear. Some of them had endured similar treatment, forced into the inner chamber against their will, knowing that refusal could mean violence or worse. Others had heard rumors of girls who had disappeared, only to be told they'd moved on or found another job. Madame Bimbo, however, remained unbothered, her focus solely on pleasing her wealthy customers. She dismissed the fear among her staff, insisting they continue as usual. For the girls, the job had become a matter of survival, and every night felt like a gamble. They knew that one misstep, one refusal, could be their end, and they might find themselves buried behind the bar just as Amoka had been. The increasing number of missing girls eventually caught the attention of the village authorities. Families and friends reported their daughters missing, and soon an investigation was launched. Unnerved, Madame Bimbo sought advice from her connections, including a police officer who frequented her bar. He warned her, "The investigations are getting serious. People are talking. If you don't want to get caught, you need to leave." Panic seized Madame Bimbo as she realized her empire was crumbling. She couldn't bear the thought of losing everything she'd built, nor could she risk the exposure of her secrets. That night, she made a hasty decision. Under the cover of darkness, she packed her belongings, boarded a canoe, and fled the village, heading towards an unfamiliar town where she hoped to start anew, leaving behind the wreckage of her past. Madame Bimbo arrived in her new village with a heart heavy with regret and a resolve to live a better life. The weight of her past actions bore down on her, and she could not escape the faces of the young women whose lives she had exploited. She knew she needed to seek forgiveness, not only from the people she had wronged but from a higher power. Determined to change, she found a small church in the village and confessed her sins to the priest, pouring out her guilt and sorrow for the lives she had harmed. The priest, moved by her repentance, prayed for her and guided her to dedicate her life to Christ. Now feeling a sense of redemption, she began to rebuild her life, determined to live simply and do right by those around her. With her age approaching menopause, she didn't think she'd find a partner, but she met a poor farmer who was kind-hearted and gentle. She didn't care about his poverty, she wanted a fresh start, a family to nurture, and to show love as she had never before. The two married, and she opened a small business, selling goods in the village market. Madame Bimbo became a regular in the church, known for her kindness and dedication to prayer. People admired her humility, though none knew her past. Years passed, and Madame Bimbo gave birth to a daughter, whom she named Ada. Ada was strikingly beautiful, bearing a strong resemblance to her mother, with large, piercing eyes that often seemed far older than her years. By the age of 6, she looked mature beyond her age, dressing and speaking with an authority that unsettled those who met her. Life for Madame Bimbo became a careful balance between her family and her business. Every morning, she would leave Ada in the care of her husband as she went to the church for prayer, then to the market to sell her goods. Despite Ada's confident appearance, she often clung to her mother before she left, her voice trembling as she begged, "Mommy, can you please stay today? I am scared." Madame Bimbo, believing her husband could watch over Ada, always reassured her, promising she would return soon. Each evening, when Madame Bimbo returned, she noticed something strange about Ada. The once vibrant, confident child now seemed withdrawn and quiet, often sitting alone outside, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. She refused food and spoke only when prompted, her voice small and subdued. Day by day, Ada's once strong spirit seemed to fade, her small frame growing thinner and her lively demeanor dimming. Madame Bimbo grew concerned, but Ada never spoke of what troubled her, and her husband brushed it off as a child's moodiness. Meanwhile, back in the village where Madame Bimbo once thrived, people resumed their lives, healing and trying to forget the memories of the missing girls. The young women who had survived Madame Bimbo's establishment remained silent, bound by the oaths they had taken in the shrine, fearful of any consequences that speaking out might bring. In time, they moved on, though the scars of their past would forever haunt them. One fateful evening, Madame Bimbo's neighbor, Ngozi, knocked on her door to borrow some salt. Hearing no answer but finding the door unlocked, she pushed it open and stepped inside. Her heart froze at the sight before her. In the dimly lit room, 9 men, including Madame Bimbo's husband, stood naked, surrounding little Ada, who sat on the floor, her face streaked with tears. Ngozi gasped in horror as she realized what was happening. The men were taking turns violating the helpless child. She let out a scream that echoed through the house, then fled into the night to alert the other villagers. By the time Madame Bimbo rushed home, abandoning her stall at the market, the men had fled, leaving Ada battered and unconscious on the floor. It spread rapidly through the village, and Madame Bimbo was consumed with grief and shame. She couldn't bring herself to speak, her mind a whirlwind of despair. Her friends tried to comfort her, but their words were like distant echoes. She wept bitterly, her heart broken as she saw her daughter's life shattered. The horror of what had happened struck her deeply, and she felt the undeniable hand of karma pressing upon her. As her friends consoled her, Madame Bimbo whispered, "I brought this upon my own child. I traded other people's daughters for wealth, and now my daughter has suffered the same fate." The realization was a bitter pill to swallow, a cruel justice for the sins of her past. Ada was taken to the hospital, where she lay unconscious, her small body battered and bruised. Madame Bimbo sat beside her, clutching her daughter's hand, her heart aching with guilt and sorrow. In her prayers, she begged for forgiveness, not only for herself but for her child, who had become a victim of her past sins. Days passed, and Ada slowly regained consciousness, though the spark in her eyes seemed lost forever. The ordeal had changed her, and Madame Bimbo feared that her daughter would never fully heal from the trauma. Determined to make things right, she vowed to dedicate her life to helping others, hoping to find some peace and to give Ada a chance at a normal life. In the years that followed, Madame Bimbo used her business earnings to support orphan girls, offering them shelter, food, and education. She became a protector to those who had no one, devoting herself to helping young girls avoid the fate she had once imposed upon others. Her daughter, though forever changed, remained by her side, a silent reminder of the past she could never escape but was determined to atone for.